Adonai roi lo echsav. Binat eshe yarbitzeni, al mei menuchot yenaleni. Nafshi yeshover, yanacheni v'maglei tzedek, leman shemo. Gam ki elech begeitz al mavet, lo hirara ki ata imadi. Shivtecha umishantecha hema yenachamuni. Tarach lefanai shulchan neged zorerai. Dishanta v'Hashem en roshi. Kosi revaya, ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni, kol yemei chayai, v'shavti bevet Adonai, leorech yamim. A Psalm of David. Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not want. Adonai makes me to lie down in green pastures, leading me beside still waters, restoring my soul, guiding me in straight paths for Adonai's name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Eternal forever. In the suddenness and grief of Abraham Rotstein's death, we gather together with each other to mourn his loss and to honor his memory. Abe was a man whose sharp intelligence was as alive in his academic and political work as it was in the quickness of his puns, even the puns he repeated regularly. His dignified and sophisticated manner was as pronounced in how he conducted himself with political and literary figures as it was in the look he created for himself in a smoking jacket, silk cravat, cigarette with cigarette holder that he was wearing the day he and Diane met, which apparently she took one look at and said, "Who the hell does he think he is?" Abe was not shy about being in the spotlight, but he was also a man who didn't seek it. He was dignified and positive, a lover of good food, of languages and culture, and a rather poor driver. When a person dies suddenly, we can hold the relief that they did not suffer, but that relief sits alongside the shock that the death came too soon, and the ache of loss we had no time to prepare for, of words unsaid and moments unlived. I extend my deepest condolences to Daniel and Azima, to Eve and Theo, to Moish and Joan, to Diane, to Eitan and Jonathan, and to Abe's grandchildren, Maya, Charlotte, and Lev. Abe's home was covered with photographs of you, and he was so proud of each of you. Tamid chacham im met, mi mevi lanu tmurato. There's no replacing a person of wisdom. There are mines for silver, and places where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from the rock. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the source of understanding? There is no replacing a person of wisdom. I ask Abe's son Daniel to come up and share some reflections.
On a frigid night in February 2009, I was startled awake by something. I lay awake listening for what it was, but all there was silence. Azima was sound asleep beside me, but I was wide awake. Something pulled me out of bed, and I felt a strong urge to write. I suddenly had thoughts of my father in my head. Memories from my childhood and ones from the recent past. I began to write a eulogy for my father 6 years ago. What I've written here is almost completely from that night. Today we mourn the loss of an intellectual, a man who had a worldview, who understood the big picture and the grand scheme. We also celebrate a man who loved detail, the afterthought, a little flourish. My dad loved itineraries and lists. In fact, he always had piles of folded papers in his back pocket, along with a fine retractable pencil which he used whenever he saw or heard a word or idea he might need later. He simply adored the written word. To him, an idea on paper was holy, something to be cherished and held close. At one point, we had delivered to 102 Admiral every Toronto daily newspaper, several Jewish weekly and monthly papers, The Economist, the Sunday New York Times, and piles of Daily Mail. And rarely were any of these thrown out. The thought of disposing of a well-written article or a brilliant idea was unthinkable. Later in life, after we had all left home, I think he finally realized he might bury himself, literally, under stacks and mountains of old yellow and dusty newspapers and articles he thought he might need one day or might refer back to. Abe liked to look good. We all remember his ascots, his interesting ties, and of course his cigarette holder. I was so happy when he finally quit smoking, but I knew I'd miss that cool cigarette holder and how handsome and almost otherworldly it made him look. My dad loved being Jewish, and throughout his whole life he showed an immense pride for his Jewish roots and what it meant to be a good Jew. A Jewish education for Eve and I was not a debatable issue, and he loved to hear about what we learned in school, especially as it related to Israel. As a Jew in Depression Montreal, he experienced anti-Semitism, and even McGill University at that time had a limited quota of Jews it allowed in. This notion of being outside the mainstream, somehow different, helped drive my father to succeed in so many of his pursuits. As I've mentioned on several occasions, it certainly wasn't easy living in the tall and formidable shadow of my dad. We locked horns many times on the issue of the pursuit of excellence. A B grade was never enough. In fact, this idea was driven home during one heated exchange when he yelled, "I don't care if you decide to be a bricklayer, just do it the best that you can." It's a philosophy we can all take something from. My dad loved to travel, and from the very beginning he took us on holidays, at first to show us the beauty of Canada from coast to coast, and then later to Europe and the Middle East. He was so proud when I decided to backpack around the globe, even if it meant delaying university. He loved the postcards and letters I would write, and to hear about the adventures David Kellman and I were on. However, he didn't understand why we didn't have a detailed itinerary when we left. This love of travel and of different cultures really stayed with me, and for this I am truly grateful. Abe loved music and encouraged us to play any instrument we wanted. As a young child, my dad would escort me to my weekly recorder lesson on Walmer Road and sit there with a proud grin as I played that week's song. although in hindsight, the fact that he was puffing away in the small practice room was probably not the healthiest way for a child to learn their instrument. The house was always filled with music, classical, jazz, Jewish music, and later world music sounds from the four corners of the globe. Again, another passion my parents planted in me that I have allowed to grow, and I thank them for it. Both Mom and Dad were musically inclined, and we sometimes played together as the Rotstein family band. Diane on piano, Dad on the ever so slightly out of tune violin, and Eve and I on the pots and pans and assorted kitchen utensils. We even recorded ourselves, and listening back would all break into laughter. I think I gained some big points with Abe when I decided to get married and have children of my own. The pride he showed when he saw his first grandchild, Maya, was amazing to me. And although he was clearly nervous to hold her, the joy that Maya, Charlotte, and now Lev brought to his life was remarkable. In his opinion, the color photocopier was one of the greatest inventions of all time. Every time he'd visit, he'd have another enlarged copy of a photo he'd snapped the week before. Most of the time they were mediocre at best, but occasionally the photo was magical. Another trait I saw in my father was the gift to engage with others of different backgrounds, people with different life stories, points of view, and opinions. He was always respectful and ready to listen, even if his opinion differed greatly. It is a great characteristic and showed tolerance and understanding. To my Uncle Morris, I want to offer my sincerest condolences. To have Abraham as your big brother must have been wonderful and at other times challenging. His footsteps were so big to follow, and he set the bar so high in terms of his academic pursuits. He loved you and respected you and valued your opinions. Seeing you two together always made me wish I had a brother of my own. I wish to thank everyone who came today to pay their respects to my father. He will never be forgotten and will be remembered with fondness, with comfort, and with happiness. Adieu, mon cher papa. May God bless you. I love you, Dad.
Abe's brother Moish will come and share some words.
We're here today to celebrate the life of my brother, and I'd like to say a few comments about our growing up and the things that transpired between us and the things my brother achieved. Have to get the papers in order first. Yeah. Abe was really representative of that generation born of immigrant parents, poor immigrants who would come here. And this was during the Great Depression. Yet, notwithstanding all these negatives, he was able to rise and rise to prominence in the professions. That generation succeeded in their business activities, in professionalism and academia. Abe succeeded well in the academic area. Our history: we were both born east of the Mordecai Richler St. Urban Street. Abe was an outstanding student, and in the schools that he attended, both English schools and Hebrew schools. In terms of extracurricular activities, he played the violin. We were both members of the high school combined orchestra. Both of us left a year too early because a year after we left the orchestra began a tour of Europe. But nevertheless, he was a good musician, continued playing the flute and the recorder after that. He was an important leader and educator in a Zionist youth movement called Habonim. And this was an important movement prior to the establishment of the State of Israel and after the State of Israel. And he inspired and educated a very wide range of young people in the Zionist idea. He allowed his brother, that's me, to accompany him sometimes to play with his friends. He always introduced me as his brother, and as a result, to his friends, I never had a name. My name was Abe's brother. This went on for many years, but eventually the friends got to know my real name. Academically, Abe pursued a BA in economics at McGill University. He graduated with honors. I think he got the Governor General's Medal. He pursued higher education in economics. He attended the universities of Chicago, Columbia, and eventually took his doctorate at the University of Toronto. After graduation and being an economist in those days, he actually pursued a business career. And he became the economist and assistant to the president of a company called Canadair, which preceded Bombardier. Their purpose, their mission was to produce aircraft. And Abe was well integrated in the top echelon of that business group. Because of his rank and his role in the company, he was assigned to a team of Canadair staff to go down to South America and sell aircraft to the different governments in South America. He was, in the process, he was flabbergasted to discover that sales were contingent on paying high commissions to buyers of aircraft. And this was a practice that was not common in Canada at that time. And so he found it sort of a strange phenomenon. And I think this is one of the reasons he decided to leave the business sector and enter academia. In academia, he joined the Department of Economics at the Toronto University, and his main teaching was in the area of Canadian economic history. He was really expert in this field, and he was, I think, one of the major proponents and experts in that department. At the same time, he became editor of the Forum magazine, at no salary, of course. And this was a very important magazine at the time. This was a very thought-provoking magazine, right, where he engaged people to write articles that were topical and were vital at that time in Canada's history. He also was an editor of books. He did produce a few books, and he really joined with others to combine books. So he was writing during this academic period. He was also involved in doing a lot of writing. Politically, he was never committed to any one party in Canada. He took positions, he told me, and voted based on issues that were vital at the time of the election. He helped organize, during his academic life, he helped organize the Committee for an Independent Canada. He did this jointly with the Minister of Finance, Walter Gordon, plus other notables in Canada at the time. This was a period when it was feared that Canadian resources and Canadian companies would be bought out by foreign interests who would be deciding Canada's industrial fate. Politically, while Abe's leanings were, I think, basically to the NDP and Liberal parties, I remember receiving a phone call advising me that he became a card-carrying member of the Conservative Party. This was a bit of a shock to me. The reason, because some of the members of the Conservative Party favored a program to regulate the sales of Canadian companies and resources to foreign interests. It followed his basic thought about Canada and maintaining a Canadian independence in the world. A public speaker and analyst. I lived abroad for many years, and I came back often to visits in Canada. And on many visits, I remember seeing and hearing Abe on TV, on radio, and his writings in the newspapers, giving his views on subjects that were topical and vital at the time. Well, that's sort of a general background of my brother. And he ended up as an academic, taught for many, many years, educated thousands of students. I must relate one story, personal. I was involved at the time. I lived abroad, and we were involved in a company that exported food. I visited a major company in the island of St. Martin and was introduced to a Mr. Van Dyke, not the painter, who headed up the company. I gave him my card, and it said Maurice Rotstein. And he said, well, I was educated in Toronto, and my favorite professor was an Abraham Rotstein. Any connection? I said, it was my brother. Well, he said, you're very welcome. You tell me what you need, and I'll deliver. So that was one of the benefits I got through my brother's academic background. Yeah. What will I remember about my brother? Notwithstanding his vital commentaries on Canadian and worldly matters, notwithstanding his commitment and success in university education, notwithstanding his involvement in writing, speaking his mind in public and in the media, I will remember him as my closest friend, as a counselor and advisor, always with good, sound judgment, ready to discuss and ready to advise. He was, I would say, the patriarch of our family and had a connection with all the members of our family, and I think each one of the family respected him as I did and really bounced off ideas with him. He was an active, interested, and committed Canadian. He was also a committed son of the Jewish people. I also remember him as a great economist, but one of the negatives that I remember is when it came to investment, that was out of his field, notwithstanding his economic training. At this point, I'd like to say, Shalom Abraham. Achi Hayakar. Farewell, my beloved brother Abe. Thank you.
I invite Mel Watkins, dear friend and colleague, to share some words.
I feel very privileged to have been asked by the family to say something about my good friend, Abraham Rotstein. My dear friend Abe had lived so long, he had kept teaching after his contemporaries had quit. He was still so sound of body and certainly of mind that it seemed to me when I saw him earlier this year that he just might live forever. We both joined the old Department of Political Economy at the University of Toronto more than 55 years ago and became the best of friends. We have so remained ever since. Our lives intersected personally, politically, and intellectually. At the beginning, I was a faculty member and he was a graduate student, but I can say without exaggeration that he was my teacher. He had a remarkable breadth of interest, from economic history to political science, to anthropology, to philosophy, to theology, to linguistics, to the history of technology. As many of us who are here today know, the 60s was the last great decade. I always told my students, if you missed it, too bad. We won't see it again. There was a surge of pent-up Canadian nationalism. Abe was the leading theorist and scholar of that movement in English Canada and one of its most prominent and innovative practitioners. As Morris mentioned, he became the editor of the then prestigious Canadian Forum. He founded the University League for Social Reform, which published a number of books. He was active in the teach-in movement on the University of Toronto campus against the American war in Vietnam. He supported Quebec's right to self-determination. He was a member of a federal government task force on foreign ownership, which included from the University of Toronto, Ed Safarian, and myself. He was one of the founders of the Committee for an Independent Canada, which morphed into the Council of Canadians and of the Canadian Institute of Economic Policy. Abe was a dissenter with the conviction and courage that takes, and as so often happens to dissenters, he was usually on the losing side. He understood that history is written by the winners, but he never lost his good cheer. Abe was evidently not your conventional economist. He was that rare creature, a public intellectual. His doctoral thesis on the fur trade drew on the approaches of Karl Polanyi, whom he had studied with at Columbia University, and with whom he co-authored the book Dahomey and the Slave Trade, and of Harold Innes, who haunted the halls of Sydney Smith. Abe taught Canadian economic history and occasionally European and courses on institutions and economics. When the department split into two departments, economics and political science, he was one of the economists who got a cross appointment to political science. He became a senior fellow at Massey College and oversaw the Southern Journalism Fellowship Program and was a visiting professor at Cambridge and Yale. He participated in the weekly gathering of the famous McLuhan Seminar and was closely involved with the Carl Planning Institute at Concordia University. He wrote extensively and beautifully. His work was always accessible. He edited and co-edited a number of books. His 1973 book, The Precarious Homestead, captures the mood of the times and his contribution to the great dialogue that was going on. He leaves behind him two almost completed manuscripts. One is a book on the fur trade, which he'd been working on all his life, his lifelong interest, and the other is his magnum opus, perhaps best described by the title of a graduate seminar he gave in political science, The Apocalyptic Tradition in Western Political Thought. When teaching evaluations were introduced, Abe consistently ranked year after year as one of the best teachers in the economics department. He was much respected by students who described him as a gentleman and as a gentle and patient person. His elegance was, of course, legendary. Our mutual friend Stephen Clarkson loved to introduce him as Count Rotstein. Abe was a world-class punster. I think John Fraser said he swam in puns. There's a website that Abe didn't know about, which I told him about, of the best 100 puns ever. And Abe makes it. For arguably his greatest pun, every dogma has its day. There's also one I really liked, Buddy, can you spare a paradigm? I miss him terribly. He was at best of friends, a person who was always there for you. Our families know and know each other. In recent times, whenever I got together with him, we talked much about our children and our grandchildren. He was a good and wise person. About 2 weeks ago, I sent him a piece. I don't live in Toronto anymore. I sent him a piece I had written about soldiers coping with life in the trenches of the First World War. He emailed me back with his characteristic generosity, and I quote him, "A very touching piece, beautifully written. The human dimension gets lost as global forces and anonymous institutions jostle one another. I hope that you and Kelly are well and enjoying our long-delayed spring. Life in Toronto is much the same, but the sun and the daffodils help a lot. Best regards, Abe." And now if I can find my cane. Thank you very much.
In the early rabbinic text, Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, Rabbi Parachia teaches, "Aseh lecha rav, kneh lecha chaver." Make for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend. True teachers do not come to us ready-made, and the impact that they make does not rest solely on their own efforts. True teachers are made by their students. Abe Rotstein was a professor for 52 years. Although he was technically retired, he taught a course this past summer and published his last article just a year ago. So many of you have turned to Abe as a teacher, a scholar, a mentor, a source of wise advice and insight. Even if you were never in his classroom, you were probably a student of his in some form. And over the decades, he has taught, challenged, and inspired thousands of students who have not only taken his courses or read his writings, but have made him their teacher. Aseh lecha rav. Abe's life and work have had wide-reaching impact. He leaves a legacy as a passionate and principled economist, fighting for Canada's economic and political strength and integrity. His strength as a teacher, though, was not limited to the world of economics or to formal education. He walked through the world as an educator. As I was talking with the family yesterday, you were describing the ways that Abe gave gifts, returning from travels with meaningful artifacts. Every gift had a lengthy explanation and layers of significance. Daniel and Eve, you talked about the ways that Abe instilled in you the importance of Jewish education, apparent in your own schooling at Bialik, and apparent in the education you provide for your children, sharing with them your father's love of Jewish music and literature, the festival celebrations, and his love of Hebrew and Yiddish. And Daniel, you so beautifully described your father passing on to you leadership of the Passover Seder. He has been your teacher in the Yiddishkeit he modeled, and he has been your teacher in placing in your hands the heritage and history that meant so much to him, supporting you to make it your own and to become a teacher in your own right. Abe taught the value of enriching culture, taking you all to theater performances, traveling various parts of the world, and introducing you to art and different kinds of food. While it may have been a little too much when he showed Yiddle Mitten Fiddle with subtitles for Eve's grade 1 birthday party, his desire was clear, wanting to bridge the people closest to him with a world of discovery and broad understanding, making the world around you a teacher, and you its curious and engaged students. Azima, as you said in our conversation yesterday, Abe never made people feel stupid. He had a fierce intellect, but he engaged with others without judgment. Eyal, you talked about the ways that he taught you and others to clarify and sharpen your thinking. The Hasidic teacher Rabbi Nachman of Breslov describes the experience of learning from a great teacher. He said, when the student receives his teacher's wisdom, he receives his face, his panim. Abe not only taught through his knowledge, he taught through the vibrancy of his whole being. That vibrancy came across in his relationship with music, manifest in a drawer full of harmonicas, readily on hand to play a song, and the song sheets he would bring to various family gatherings. Moish, you described Abe's days in the Habonim Dror youth movement and what you called his rampant dancing, including his ability to dance the Krakowiak while playing harmonica at the same time. He showed the same vibrancy in learning how to ride a bike at age 70 in the parking lot at Loblaws, in his travels around the world, including a recent trip to Israel for Charlotte's bat mitzvah. Abe relished every opportunity. Every moment could become an occasion. It's quite moving to know that his last lecture was given in his grandson Lev's grade 3 classroom. The topic was the fur trade, and all the children were hanging off him, filled with delight and curiosity. The world has lost a great teacher. In the words of Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, straight from the fear of loss, I plunged into the fear of being lost. I couldn't stay long enough between them in the sweet little no man's land of my everlasting passing days. My hands are hands of searching, hands of testing, hands of hope, hands of gloom, always fumbling around tables, between papers and in drawers, and in closets and in my clothes that have seen their share of loss. With hands that search for what is lost, I caress your face. And with hands afraid of loss, I hold you close, Feel around your eyes, your mouth, like a blind man, as if to measure, as if to wander, to measure and to wander. Because hands afraid of loss are the only hands for love. Once I saw a violinist playing, and I thought, between his right hand and his left hand, there was only the violin. But what a between. What music that was. Yeheh zichrono livracha. May Abe's memory be a blessing. Burial will take place at Shaarei Tzedek section of Roselawn Cemetery. Following burial, Shiva will begin at 102 Admiral Road, and evening services will be at 8 p.m. The services will be at 7:30 p.m. Would you please rise for the memorial prayer? מלא רחמים, שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. את נשמת אברהם צבי בן חיים ופגה, שהלך לעולמו, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתו. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו. ונאמר Amen. Exalted, compassionate God, give infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure to the soul of Avraham Tzvi ben Chaim Vefega, who is gone to his eternal home. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.